Hey guys, this is Steve here from Spirit Science and Metaphysics. I wasn't expecting my first YouTube video to be about a conspiracy, but there's really something that needs to be said about this whole Ebola thing. There's tons of information to look at here, so let's take a dive into what is actually going on. First of all, we need to stop believing everything we hear coming from mainstream media sources. The accounts they give are gross misrepresentations of what is actually occurring. Before we can even begin to explore how Ebola is a conspiracy, we first have to take off our Fox News propaganda goggles for a moment. Forget what you have heard about Ebola. Here's the main point this video will attempt to communicate. The outbreak of Ebola is a conspiracy that was staged, planned, and forcefully administered to the people of West Africa via bioweapons testing as a way to justify the occupation of African countries by the US military, to depopulate our planet, to make the CDC, pharmaceutical companies, and their shareholders billions of dollars, and to frighten us to agree to take poisonous vaccines, to surrender our rights, and to comply with martial law. It will infect the US population by design, to turn America into a frightened, compliant police state fit for the introduction of the New World Order. I promise this will all sound a little less crazy at the end of the video. In a statement to the United Nations Business Council in 1994, David Rockefeller said, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis and the nations will accept the New World Order." This could potentially be the major crisis the global elitists are hoping for, and it has all of the ingredients of a classic false flag operation. I recently wrote an article on my website which contained the report of a man from Ghana who I have personally been in contact with, so no, he's not just some made-up guy, who claims that the Red Cross is responsible for the spread of the virus. It is only contracted by those who receive treatment and injections from the Red Cross. This is why Liberians and Nigerians have begun kicking the Red Cross out of their countries. Here are the four main reasons why Ebola is a conspiracy, according to this man in Ghana. It was used as a way to justify getting troops on the ground to secure oil supplies and set up military bases there. Nigeria, as of 2011, ranked in as the largest oil producer in Africa and the 11th largest producer of oil in the entire world, averaging 2.28 million barrels per day. The second reason he lists is that Sierra Leone is the world's largest supplier of diamonds. For the past 4 months, they've been on strike due to horrible working conditions and slave pay. A reason was also needed to get troops on the ground in Sierra Leone to force an end to the diamond miners' strike. When miners refuse to work, troops are set in, even if they have to kill and replace them all. The only desire is to get diamonds back flowing out of the country. Of course, to launch multiple campaigns to invade these countries separately would be way too fishy. But something like Ebola allows access to an entire area simultaneously. Here's a news article talking about the diamond miner strike and how police have killed multiple workers in January of this year. The third reason he gives: in addition to stealing Nigerian oil and forcing Sierra Leone back to mining, troops have also been sent into forced vaccinations, aka deadly Ebola poison, onto those Africans who are not foolish enough to take them willingly. As more and more news articles are released, as they have been in Liberia, informing the populace of the US lies of manipulation, more and more Africans are refusing to visit the Red Cross. Troops will force these vaccinations upon the people to ensure the visible appearance of an Ebola pandemic. And the last reason he states that Ebola is a conspiracy is because they're trying to curate the appearance of an Ebola pandemic that will be used to scare millions into taking the Ebola vaccine, which is in reality the pandemic. Already they have started with stories of how it has been brought to the US and has appeared in Dallas, and how doctors were cured but black infected are not being allowed to be treated, etc. So this is first-hand testimony coming from a man within an infected country, claiming that his people already know that the US government has ulterior motives in mind here. But is there any evidence to back up his claims? A scientist from Liberia who is a plant pathologist and a former teacher at the University of Delaware recently wrote an article claiming that Ebola is a manufactured virus created in the Kenema Government Hospital in Sierra Leone by researchers from Tulane University in the US, and that they are testing it as a bioweapon on the people of West Africa. As he states, there is urgent need for affirmative action in protecting the less affluent and of poorer countries, especially African citizens whose countries are not scientifically and industrially endowed as the United States and most Western countries, sources of most viral or bacterial GMOs that are strategically designed as biological weapons. It is most disturbing that the US government has been operating a viral hemorrhagic fever bioterrorism research laboratory in Sierra Leone. Now, this might sound a little crazy, but most people don't realize that the US government has had a biomedical research lab in Sierra Leone since the 1970s, and that researchers from Sierra Leone have been doing experiments like these with viruses like Ebola for decades. Why would they do this? Well, according to the Army Times, filoviruses like Ebola have been of interest to the Pentagon since the late 1970s, mainly because Ebola and its fellow viruses have high mortality rates. In the current outbreak, roughly 60% to 72% of those who have contracted the disease have died, and its stable nature in aerosol makes it attractive as a potential biological weapon. If you search Kenema Government Hospital into Google, it will take you to this page. If you click on the People tab, it will show you a list of people from Tulane University who have been working with this hospital for the purpose of biomedical research and testing. Now here is where it gets weird. In 2007, Tulane University received a $3.8 million grant from the National Institutes of Health for hemorrhagic femur research in the biomedical laboratory in Kenema, under contract with the World Health Organization. And as the report here from the university states, the initial round of clinical testing has been completed for the first diagnostic test kits that will aid in bioterrorism defense against a deadly viral disease. And the article concludes by a statement from the president of Corgenix Medical Corporation. As a group, we intend to expand this program to address other important infectious agents with with both clinical health issues and threat of bioterrorism, such as Ebola. Okay, so in 2007, Tulane University, who works with the Kenema Government Hospital, received $3.8 million to develop diagnostic test kits for Ebola. And in 2009, researchers at Tulane received a 5-year, $7,073,000 grant from the National Institute of Health to fund the continued development of detection kits for loss of viral hemorrhagic fever. And as the report says, most recently, a new loss of fever ward is being constructed in Sierra Leone at the Kenema Government Hospital. When finished, it will be better equipped to assist patients affected by the disease and will hopefully help to end the spread of it. So here is the original PDF from Tulane University. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can even see a diagram of the ward they were attempting to build. Now, do we actually think that the US government would pump over $10 million of taxpayer money into a research lab for sub-Saharan African people because they care about the civilians and don't want them to get sick? They say it was for loss of fever research to treat people there, but there's no reason to believe that the American government would give a shit about the health of West African people. And the previous grant even stated that the grant was for doing research and developing detection kits against bioweapons like Ebola. Now, the Kenema Hospital is actually one of the main centers of the Ebola outbreak. And we all know that if you want to do testing and research regarding a virus, you need to have that virus on site. With all of the money being pumped into Ebola research and hemorrhagic fever treatment at this hospital, you better believe that they had live Ebola strains within the research facility. I think we need to question research's role here in the manufacturing and spread of the Ebola virus. Is it possible that they actually developed Ebola there as a bioweapon? We will look at this more deeply in a bit. And keep in mind, this Ebola testing was all done under funding and contract by the US government and the World Health Organization. This facility was known to conduct bioweapons research on behalf of the US Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. Now, why were they so interested in studying Ebola all of a sudden right before a major outbreak? Why were they building a new ward as if they were anticipating or expecting some kind of breakout or pandemic? Here's an article published in Nature that talks about how this Kenema Hospital has struggled to continue its research during the Ebola outbreak. Researchers worked hard to study the disease that was filling the wards, to trace its path into and through the country, but the outbreak consumed the hospital and research was put on hold. Now, at the bottom of the article in Nature, it says that meanwhile, hearing rumors that Ebola was a hoax or a conspiracy, people from the surrounding city attacked the hospital, throwing rocks at the building. Police used tear gas to drive the rioters away. Now, remember what my man in Ghana said and what the scientist from Liberia said? That Ebola is a manufactured virus that is being spread by the hospitals. Why are these people under the impression that this Ebola bioweapon research facility is responsible for the spread of the Ebola virus? This is why you see the Ebola is real propaganda everywhere, because they need to indoctrinate the population who is still clueless about the origin of the virus. If Ebola is real, then why do we need all this propaganda? Here's another article from Reuters talking about how the Ebola Center, this hospital, was on guard against protesters. So the hospital actually had to be guarded against the growing anger of locals who were pissed at the research and testing they were doing there because they felt it was responsible for making them sick. And here's a report from the LA Times on the death of 8 Ebola aid workers who were killed by civilians who believed they were trying to do them harm. And if we scroll down a bit, we can see it read, "The assault followed similar attacks against medical workers or health officials in several other villages and towns in recent weeks. Last month, riots erupted after a medical team sprayed a marketplace in the same region as rumors spread that it was a conspiracy to infect the population." Here is a report from Fox News saying that at least 8 Ebola aid workers and journalists were reportedly murdered and dumped into a latrine in a remote village in Guinea. This is a frightening example of the growing distrust locals have of foreigners coming to help stem the mushrooming health crisis. So, of course, Fox News is going to make it seem as though the government is coming to help the civilians there. Because nothing fights off a fucking fever better than 4,000 armed military troops with loaded weapons. Give me a break. We have to remember that the CEO of Fox News is Rupert Murdoch, and he and Lord Jacob Rothschild purchased a total of $11 million of equity positions with Genie Industry Corporation totaling an 11% stake in the corporation back in 2010. Nigeria, as we already mentioned, is a world leader in the production of oil. So you better believe Fox News is going to be totally biased when reporting on the reasons for military establishment in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. We need to start listening to the people and not to the puppets on TV who are having their strings pulled by people with invested interest in big oil in African countries. Do you remember earlier this year when MH17 was shot down on its way to Australia? Aboard that plane was Glenn Thomas, who was the Director of Coordinations for the World Health Organization and was a leading expert in AIDS research and the Ebola virus. According to rumors, he knew that the Kenema government hospital was doing bioweapons development with Ebola and was administering it to the civilians under the guise of precautionary tests. And as this article here reports, Glenn Thomas was aware of evidence showing that the lab had manipulated a test and falsely diagnosed it positive for Ebola on behalf of Tulane University in order to justify a coercive medical treatment to the population and force them to submit to an experimental vaccine that, in fact, gave them Ebola. Glenn Thomas had refused to go along with the cover-up, unlike some of his workers at the Institute of Health, and they're all now well aware that Glenn Thomas was murdered. And here is a report from the United Nations office at Geneva where Glenn Thomas actually spoke on behalf of the World Health Organization and disagreed with the pharmaceutical company MSF that the Ebola outbreak was out of control. So just to recap here, a man living in Ghana and a plant pathology expert in Liberia claimed that the Kenema Government Hospital and Tulane University have been doing bioweapons testing there with the Ebola virus and that it was spread by the facility. The US government has pumped over $10 million into the biomedical research lab in Kenema to do testing with live strains and develop detection kits for Ebola since 2007, and even developed a new ward as if they were anticipating a crisis, because we all know how benevolent the American government is. Kenema happens to be one of the first cities in which Ebola broke out, and rumors started spreading that the hospital was responsible for manufacturing and spreading the virus. Locals started figuring out what was going on and started attacking the hospital and killing the aid workers, and the hospital had to actually shut down its research as reported in Nature. An Ebola expert who worked for the World Health Organization apparently knew a false positive was diagnosed on purpose to justify forced medical treatment and ended up being murdered on his way to a high-profile conference in Australia. So are you following so far? And if this isn't fishy enough for you yet, did you know that the CDC actually has a patent on the Ebola virus itself and has had this patent for almost half a decade? The US government has a legal monopoly on the Ebola virus and all strains which are 70% similar or higher in their genetic sequence. Here is a summary of the patent as presented on Natural News. Now, for those who don't know what a patent is, it is essentially a government-enforced monopoly that is exclusively granted to persons or organizations. It allows that person or organization to exclusively profit from the invention or deny others the ability to exploit the invention for their own profit. So technically, nobody can use Ebola as a bioweapon, and anybody who invents a vaccine carrying small amounts of the Ebola virus will have to pay royalties back to the CDC. So here is the original patent right here, and here's the patent number. Notice the filing date of the patent. It's 2009. That is the same year that the National Institute of Health granted Tulane University over $7 million for Ebola research in Sierra Leone. Now, why the hell does the CDC hold a patent on a disease? Not a cure or a treatment, but on the actual living virus strain. Is it because they were perhaps responsible for manufacturing this organism as a bioweapon over the last decade, as our scientists from Liberia claim? Will they start to claim royalties off of mandatory vaccinations and Ebola detection kits that have been developed under federally funded research teams in Sierra Leone since 2007? I want someone to explain to me why over $10 million in taxpayers' money has been pumped into Ebola medical research in Kenema right before the outbreak, why the CDC patented the virus right before the outbreak, shortly after these grants were given to Tulane University to do Ebola testing in West Africa, and why the people of Africa are attacking the hospital and killing the AIDS workers, believing that they are the ones responsible for creating and spreading the virus. Now, on top of all of this, the outbreak is actually correlated with major vaccination campaigns. A Thailand-based writer has recently pointed out the strange coincidence of the earliest breakout in Guinea and how it correlates with 3 major vaccine campaigns conducted by the World Health Organization and the UN's Children Agency. At least 2 of the vaccination programs were implemented by MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, while some of those vaccines were produced by Sanofi Pasteur, which is a French pharmaceutical whose major shareholder is the Rothschild Group. This report uncovers the French connection to the African Ebola pandemic, and he goes on to say that the pharmaceutical and biotech industries will have profited handsomely from the Ebola crisis when biodefense research generals, high civil servants, and UN bureaucrats sheepishly sign multi-million euro R&D contracts. So, let me show you something suspicious here. This right here is a clinical trial from just 2 months before the outbreak that was done by Techmira Pharmaceutical Company. They were testing out an Ebola vaccine in healthy human volunteers just months before Ebola happened to break out. And guess who funded this study? The US Department of Defense. Actually, Techmira started developing this anti-Ebola vaccine under a $140 million contract with the DoD. So Techmira is literally making a killing off of this Ebola breakout, and they are actually one of the main players on the effort to develop a vaccine for the virus that was created and patented by the US government. So why was the DoD putting hundreds of millions of dollars into trying to develop an Ebola vaccine before a major outbreak even occurred? I think that's quite the coincidence. And they also received a $1.5 million grant from Monsanto following completion of specified program objectives. Now, Monsanto is a company that wants to control the entire world's food supply, depopulate the planet, and is the leader in the production of genetically modified foods. They are literally the foundation of the New World Order, and the potential value of this transaction with Techmira Pharmaceuticals could reach up to $86.2 million following the successful completion of all program milestones. Due to the massive amount of money pouring into this pharmaceutical company, their stock prices have skyrocketed. According to an article, their stock has increased by 11.3% as the death toll in West Africa crossed 700 people. Investors rushed back to buy the company's stock as they expected the FDA to take action to resume clinical trials. This article also reports that the head of Wellcome Trust, a global charity, said that people at high risk of catching the disease should be offered experimental drugs to check their effectiveness. So yeah, here's a new drug containing a live Ebola virus courtesy of Monsanto. Let us inject it into you even though you are totally healthy. I swear we aren't doing this to make you sick, to create hysteria so the West can profit. Here's a graph of their stock prices, which just so happened to skyrocket to the highest in company history right at the time of the Ebola outbreak. If Monsanto is supporting this vaccine company, you better believe they aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And guess who's a major shareholder in Monsanto? Bill Gates. And he's also famous for trying to create and implement vaccines. Bill Gates owns 500,000 shares in Monsanto, totaling over $23 million. In a recent TED Talk he gave, Bill Gates actually slips and says that vaccinations will be used as a method of depopulation. So here it is here.
Let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
Now, what the hell do vaccines have to do with population control? If we make really good vaccines, we can bring the population down by 10 to 15%. Aren't vaccines and healthcare supposed to save lives, not kill people off? Bill Gates, the richest man on the planet, works super closely with Monsanto, and Monsanto works with Big Pharma. There's a shitload of money to be made by the West off of this Ebola virus. Not only by the US and the CDC, who have a legal monopoly on Ebola, but also by Big Pharma and their investors. The more people get infected with this disease, the more money is to be made. This is a gold mine for the global elitists. Manufacture a bioweapon in Sierra Leone using taxpayers' dollars, patent it, create a deliberate outbreak in West Africa first after doing some preliminary vaccine trials with Big Pharma, and then allow the population to become infected so you can administer experimental vaccines which will further infect the population. Vanderbilt University has recently been awarded $4.4 million from the DoD, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recently signed a $25 million contract with MAP Biopharmaceuticals for Ebola research. It's obvious that profit is a motive here, almost as if these companies are kind of, pulling for an Ebola outbreak. And the CDC, the guys who actually own a patent on this fucking virus, recently admitted that they could have done more to prevent the spread. Yeah, well, we could have done more, but, we've only been studying the Ebola virus since the 1970s, and we only have a $7 billion budget in the most advanced medical research facility on the planet. We could have done more, but we have corporate interests in mind here, and we need to get troops on the ground in the West and create hysteria back home, so we decided to let it spread a bit. Come on. Not many people realize that the former director of the CDC, who resigned in 2009, is now the chief medical editor of ABC News. He is literally the ultimate propaganda machine. He was involved in the patenting and funding of Ebola bioweapons research long before the outbreak even occurred. And here he is on the front lines of ABC News. Let's hear what he has to say.
Good morning, Rich. Robin, Ebola is so deadly, we need to do everything we can to keep it out of the country.
There you go. Robin, it's so deadly, we need to do everything we can to keep it out of the country. And how are we going to do that? We're going to bring all the Americans that are infected back home.
But the man in Texas shows us that even when you're doing the right things, infected people can slip through. I'm at the airport here in Monrovia, where he took off and where I flew out of just last month. And I went through the screening. I saw CDC doing the training. They're doing the right things. Every passenger who comes into this terminal fills out a questionnaire. Do you have symptoms of Ebola? Have you had contact with someone with Ebola? They take your temperature. Do you have a fever? If you fail those, you're pulled aside. You don't get on the plane. But the thing about Ebola is you can be infected, and it can take 21 days to show symptoms. So infected people can get on the plane, but they won't make other passengers sick. But as Dr. Frieden said, there may be people who had contact with this man in Texas who get sick, but it shouldn't spread from there. Robin? All right.
Infected people can get on the plane, but they won't make other passengers sick because the symptoms won't show up for 21 days. Some people may have been in contact with the man from Texas, but it shouldn't spread from there. Notice how chill he is when he says all of this stuff. That's because it's part of the plan to allow Ebola to reach the American people. That's why the CDC and the US government are so lenient and nonchalant about everything. Why are we still allowing infected people to come back to the States, given how contagious we know Ebola to be? Now, here's where media totally screwed up. This is horrible. This is worse than Sandy Hook right here. Here's a news summary by the Daily Mail. ABC News was filming one of the infected American nurses being transferred onto a plane, and you will notice that right in the mix of things is a man without a hazmat suit on, just chilling there with a clipboard and some sunglasses on. Who is he, and why is he not wearing protection even though he is in contact with the workers? Both the ambulance company and Emory University Hospital said the unprotected man with the clipboard is not one of their employees, meaning he is likely a CDC employee. The man is seen boarding the flight after exchanging several objects with the hazmat crew. The man appears to have flown on the same flight as infected Miss Vinson, as he is seen in footage of her getting into an ambulance at an airport in Atlanta. So, if the CDC really does not want this virus to spread, why is one of their employees exchanging potentially infected items with workers in hazmat suits? Why is he not wearing a suit or even a pair of gloves or a face mask? There are only three possible explanations here. Either Ebola is actually not that big of a threat and it's safe to be around an infected person without wearing anything. Either the CDC isn't concerned about whether or not its employees get infected, or this is all just a massive staged event and all of these guys are crisis actors that got caught in the act pretending to participate in a medical emergency to convince people Ebola is coming to get us. I believe that this is being staged and that they slipped up here and screwed themselves over. Do you guys remember the Robbie Parker Sandy Hook interview? If you haven't seen that, go watch that. It's literally so bad. I don't know how Americans can fall for that shit. But check this one out. Here is a CNN interview with the family members of an Ebola patient. Neither of them look or sound concerned, and when the old lady starts talking, watch how the man looks over to the board where her script is written, and then she starts looking over there too and starts reading words off of it the entire time. Now let's see what No Y has to say about her son with Ebola.
Grieving now as your uncle fights for his life. I want to give his mother, Eric Duncan's mother, a chance, No Y, to make a message to her son. No Y, can you tell us what you want to send to him, what you want to say to him now?
Yeah, I want to say that I lost my son. I want to speak to him. I want to tell him hello. I want to hug him. And I pray for him every day and night. The family member, every one of us will love him because anything happen to us, he always there for us. So I want to tell him that everybody, the doctor, the nurses, I tell them thank you. Every one of them who go closer to my son, Eric Duncan, I tell them thank you plenty. I tell every one of you who in the country, I tell you thank you for my son. I love him. All the family members love him. We pray for him.
No concern in her voice at all. If someone asked me how I felt about my dying son, would I really need to read off of a fucking script? Come on now. This is all being staged to create fear in the hearts of the American people so that they think that they need vaccination and governmental protection. Expect reports to come out saying it has spread in Africa and in America. Actually, this month, a statement came out from the U.S. Department of Defense saying that the potential spread of Ebola into Central and Southern America is a real possibility. And I quote, "By the end of the year, there's supposed to be 1.4 million people infected with Ebola and 62% of them dying, according to the CDC, said Marine Corps General John F. Kelly. That's horrific, and there is no way we can keep Ebola contained in West Africa. If it comes to the Western Hemisphere, many countries will have little ability to deal with an outbreak of the disease," the general said. So, much like West Africa, it will rage for a period of time. Now notice here how he says that there is supposed to be 1.4 million people infected. Not that they are expecting or that they are predicting. Not only does the CDC not have hopes of stopping Ebola from spreading, they say that there is supposed to be over 1 million people infected by the end of the year, as if this is a part of their plan. Well, of course it's a part of their plan. They've been developing it as a bioweapon for the last 7 years, patented it in 2009, and billions of dollars will be made by the US and Big Pharma from this Ebola outbreak. And they get to depopulate Africa in the process. The idea is to get it to spread back home to the US so that they can begin setting up quarantines and administering vaccines. On July 31st of this year, right amidst the Ebola outbreak, Barack Obama actually revised the list of quarantinable diseases to include, and I quote, "severe acute respiratory syndromes, which are diseases that are associated with fever and signs and symptoms of pneumonia or other respiratory illnesses, are capable of being transmitted from person to person, and that either are causing or have the potential to cause a pandemic, or upon infection are highly likely to cause mortality or serious morbidity if not properly controlled. This sounds a little bit like Ebola, doesn't it? And what a convenient time to revise the list during an Ebola outbreak. And just so you know, this is already happening. Today it was announced that 3 people from Ohio are under quarantine right now, and 142 are being monitored for symptoms after Dallas nurse Amber Vinson visited Northeast Ohio last week to see family and plan her wedding before falling ill upon her return to Texas. This was the same nurse that was a part of the crisis act and caught on camera by ABC News with the CDC worker who wasn't protected. It was the girl on the stretcher. She traveled across the fucking country all the way to Ohio and then apparently got ill before coming back home. If she did have Ebola, why the hell would they allow her to travel across the country? Wouldn't you think the US government or the CDC would have a problem with this? So either the CDC and US government doesn't care if it spreads, or this is yet another staged event to create fear in the American people. Either way, there is way too much evidence piling up that this is a massive conspiracy. So yeah, let's just let an infected nurse travel across the country right when she gets home, and go infect the population up north there, and then, go quarantine the population up there. Fucking ridiculous. Okay. Now, what are the protocols in case someone is confirmed to have been infected with Ebola? Well, let's ask the Illuminati chairman himself, President Obama.
First of all, what I've directed the CDC to do is that as soon as somebody is diagnosed with Ebola, we want a rapid response team, a SWAT team, essentially, from the CDC to be on the ground as quickly as possible, hopefully within 24 hours, so that they are taking the local hospital step by step through exactly what needs to be done and make.
That's right. If someone catches Ebola, he wants a SWAT team on site. What the hell do people with weapons and armored vehicles have anything to do with a fucking virus? Why not send over nurses or doctors? Why a SWAT team? Now, what would happen if through some means, either through vaccination, a deliberate bioweapons attack by the US on its own people, or the spread of Ebola from an affected nurse, if Ebola were to infect an entire city, or a whole state? Martial law would break out. Military governance involving the suspension of ordinary law. But this can't be accomplished unless we willingly comply with it. The only reason even the sheep of America would comply with this is if there was a pandemic at hand, or something that appears to be a pandemic. They're going to push fear of Ebola onto the American people and then encourage us to purchase Ebola preparedness kits. They're going to tell us that the virus has mutated and has now become airborne and will force mandatory vaccination upon us as a precautionary measure while the majority of people are quarantined. I would not even doubt that they're going to issue a false flag attack against their own people to get us to surrender our rights, to depopulate the country, and to profit off of our sickness, and to justify going into martial law, just, as a public safety measure. We have already seen them do stuff like this with 9/11. We've already seen them pull this shit before. Everyone knows the US government was directly involved with the Twin Tower attacks. There's no denying this at this point. Ebola is the next government-initiated attack on the agenda. The economy will collapse shortly after, and a new world order will be introduced. Now, let me repeat the thesis of my video that I mentioned at the very beginning. The outbreak of Ebola is a conspiracy that was staged, planned, and forcefully administered to the people of West Africa via bioweapons testing as a way to justify the occupation of African countries by the US military to depopulate our planet, to make the CDC and pharmaceutical companies and their shareholders billions of dollars, and to frighten us to agree with taking poisonous vaccines, to surrender our rights, and to comply with martial law. It will infect the US population by design to turn America into a frightened, compliant police state fit for the introduction of the New World Order. So what can we do about this? We've seen all of the evidence here. We've seen that this virus has been federally funded since at least 2007. Everyone in Africa already knows this. They're freaking out. They're throwing rocks at hospitals. They're killing AIDS workers. And back at home, you see people walking around infected areas, exchanging items with people in hazmat suits. And then after the lady leaves the hospital, she travels up country and infects a bunch of other civilians up there, and then they start quarantining them. This is crazy. So what are we going to do about it? Well, first of all, don't take the vaccines, even if they're mandatory. The CDC owns a patent on them. They're going to be making royalties. This is what they want. They're going to tell you that you're going to need to take them for your best interest because it's easily spread. The disease has mutated or some shit. Don't take them. Don't comply with martial law. And don't believe the stuff you hear coming from Fox, BBC, and CNN. These corporations, they're owned by people invested in big oil and big business, okay? It's just propaganda. And most importantly, don't be scared. Honestly, stop freaking out over the whole Ebola thing. Most people die from poor diet and car crashes. So don't let the global elitists fool you into complying with their fear-based, profit-driven agenda. Please share this video with everyone you know, your parents, your friends, grandma and grandpa, your cat. Knowledge is power, and the world needs to wake up to the truth about the conspiracy of Ebola.